How is that for enthusiasm? Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Evelyn Gates, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. I'm also a proud City Club member and a past City Club speaker. It is my great pleasure today to introduce you to today's speaker, Michael Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club. Very recently, in fact, just last week, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, released independent studies indicating that the Earth's surface temperatures in 2015 were the warmest on record since record keeping began in 1880. In fact, as has been widely reported, the data indicates that our planet's surface temperatures have increased by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. And I will tell you as a physicist, what really concerns me is not just the temperature increase, but the rate of change. When you change something faster than the system can respond, it can become very unstable. The warming trend of the past 35 years is alarming. 15 of the 16 warmest years on record have occurred in the years since 2001. Research indicates that the change is linked to the increased release of carbon dioxide and other human-made emissions into the atmosphere. Last month, in December 2015, at the United Nations Paris Conference on Climate Change, representatives of 195 countries signed a legally binding and universal agreement to lower greenhouse gas emissions, with the goal of keeping the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. This is a global problem and one that demands our urgent attention. While the data provide convincing evidence, there remain some individuals who express disbelief in the seriousness of climate change and speak against the efforts of those corporations, organizations, and individuals who promote working to reduce carbon emissions. In October of 2015, Peter Wood, president of the National Association of Scholars, offered one such perspective here at City Club, voicing concerns over the potential impact campus-wide sustainability movements might have on open discourse and academic freedom. Our speaker today offers another perspective, how clean energy is transforming our country for the better. Michael Brune is the executive director of the Sierra Club, the largest grassroots environmental organization in the country, and one at the forefront of sustainability movement efforts in the United States. Mr. Brune has dedicated his career to combating climate change, from his first environmental job at what is now known as Forest Ethics, to his position as executive director at the Rainforest Action Network for 7 years, to writing his book, Coming Clean: Breaking America's Addiction to Oil and Coal, which details his vision for a true clean energy future. He is a graduate of Westchester University in Pennsylvania, holding degrees in both economics and finance. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please welcome Executive Director of the City Club, Michael Brune. Sierra Club.
All right. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Thanks, Evelyn, for your introduction and job change. And thanks, everybody, for coming. Let me also first start by thanking some of our campaign partners who are here in the room. So I wanted to give a shout out to the good folks at the NAACP who are here. A shout out to the great folks at Blue Green Alliance who are here, Ohio Environmental Council, Interfaith Power and Light, Audubon Society, the Lutheran Metro Services, Dovetail Solar, Ohio Citizen Action, Mike Foley from the Sustainability Office. If you're here, good to see you, even though I've never met you. Right here. Hi. Thanks. And I have to say, it is great to be here at the City Club. I've never spoken here before, but in the green room before coming here today, Dan was kind enough to give me this book, A Century of Free Speech at the City Club of Cleveland. And anytime you have a chance to stand on the stage at a place where Babe Ruth and Rosa Parks and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, President Obama have spoken before, there's a fair amount of pressure. So I am going to do something unusual today. in this talk. It's something that you probably, if you have never heard of it, you probably at least don't often hear this coming from an environmentalist or someone who works on climate issues. But before I do, let me ask a question of all of you. When you think about climate change, when you think about the challenges that we face, and as you look across the landscape in the United States or around the world, and you see what is already happening, and you look at the response so far coming from our government, leading corporations, do you think we're going to meet this challenge? So raise your hand if over the next, say, 30 years, you think that our civilization, our society, will largely be successful in responding to the challenge of climate change. Raise your hand. All right. That is by far the most optimistic perspective I have ever heard from any audience I have ever spoken to. And I'm not even exaggerating. Good on you, Cleveland. Because what I often hear and what I often see is maybe 10% of people raise their hands. And the reasons for this are pretty clear, right? Because I think we all know, no matter how much you're looking into this issue, it is really clear that the challenge we face is pretty steep. I've been working on this issue for about 20 years. And for most of the first, say, 10, 15, 16 years that I've been working on climate change, most of the conversation was about the pending apocalypse, right? Almost every news article, almost every TV story, almost every blog that was out there, even today, still focuses on the rate of destruction that we're likely to experience. And we're already seeing it. You see it in California, in the presence of the drought that we've been under, the worst in recorded history. You see it in the form of wildfires, extreme weather events. You see it when you talk about species loss across the United States and around the world. When you start to think about climate refugees and what will happen when the glaciers in the Himalayas start to go dry or start to melt too quickly. When you actually think about the ramifications of further warming, it gets pretty scary. Knowing that we've already seen about 9 degrees, 0.8, 0.9 degrees Celsius of warming so far, and that under the most ambitious projections, if we're able to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's going to get pretty bad. And then when you compare that challenge to the entrenched power and the entrenched wealth that we find in the fossil fuel industry, the combined power of the coal industry, the gas industry, the oil industry, and the industries that support them, and their hold on government at all levels, challenge can be pretty daunting. And then when you combine that with the level of discourse that we have in the United States, and our ability as a society across the political spectrum to actually acknowledge that this is a problem, what Evelyn was talking about a couple minutes ago, to actually acknowledge that this is a problem and to begin to debate about solutions to that problem, the fact that we're not even there, really, as a society, where there's the competition of ideas, those three factors, the scale of the challenge, the fact that there's, to make this change, we have to break through a logjam among the most profitable, most wealthy, most successful companies in the history of the world, and that by and large our political conversation is stunted, it's muted, it's not mature enough to actually face the scale of the challenge. It is understandable to feel as though we've got a long way to go. And there's a Harvard professor who a couple weeks ago said that a psychologist could barely dream up a worse combination of events or a better combination of events to induce paralysis and inaction. And it's true. If you want to find a way to stifle inaction, you put these three things together. And actually, this is intentional. Most of the discourse, most of what we hear either from fossil fuel interests, not all, but many companies, and most of what we hear from elected officials or even other folks in the private sector who don't want to take action on climate change is designed to manufacture inaction. or manufacture confusion, or to depress any sense that we actually can make a difference. But I think the reason why, I'm not sure, and I'm going to ask later, why so many of you raised your hands in expressing the hope that we actually, and the belief that we will respond. The reason why you did, my guess, is that you're already beginning to see changes. And you're already beginning to look at our movement and notice that we look and act a lot differently than we did just a few years ago. And I trace the turnaround to probably the first efforts in the 1970s, where you saw the birth of the whole Earth catalog, and you saw a few people start to install solar panels on their farms, on their rooftops. Some of them wanted to disconnect from society altogether, get off the grid completely. Some of them thought that clean energy was just cool and scientifically amazing, that they could power their lives, their homes, their buildings, their offices, a school with solar energy. And house by house by house, we began to see a few tiny, very isolated examples of what a different world might look like. Jimmy Carter put solar panels up on the roof of the White House. And that was the beginning of an alternative vision for clean energy. And frankly, it stayed there for a really long time. And it didn't advance. It was always seen as something that do-gooders would do, or commie, pinko, socialist, Birkenstock-wearing folks from Berkeley. But what that led to, not to disparage it, because these were folks who were pioneers in the idea that we could power society with 100% clean energy. And what they were able to do was to inspire enough people that it led to a very quiet but one of the most powerful movements in the history of progressive change in this country to begin to install renewable portfolio standards in state after state, or energy efficiency resource standards, or what's known as decoupling legislation, where utilities can profit from producing less energy. And all of these policies, which are pretty wonky, built a market for clean energy. And so today, we have 30 states that have set a minimum standard for clean energy all across the US. We have dozens of utilities that have made billions of dollars in saving energy. Most of the rest of the country, with the current exception for Ohio, is moving to invest dramatically in energy efficiency, saving billions of dollars, celebrating the fact that a state can come together, conservatives, liberals, and progressives, and unite around the idea that creating jobs while cutting air pollution and cutting water pollution and cutting carbon pollution and promoting economic resiliency is actually a good idea. Plus, when you save billions of dollars, it adds icing onto the cake. So what is happening all across the country is that the spell is being broken. People are realizing that we can power our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, our universities, our cities, our cars, our businesses, our states, our country with clean energy. And what has happened over the last 15 years gives me the most hope of anything. Because what we've seen has been a dramatic surge in our movement. We're more diverse, we're more broad, we're more powerful, we're more sophisticated than we ever have been. 15 years ago, if you remember, in the early parts of the Bush administration, there was a proposal coming from the Cheney Energy Task Force to build 150 new coal-fired power plants all across the country, in almost every state. Utility executives got so excited about this, they added several dozen more proposals. And together, almost 200 new coal plants were being proposed everywhere, all across the country. What this would have done would have been to lock in coal as the dominant source of electricity for the next half century. It would have virtually guaranteed that our country wouldn't have met the challenge to fight climate change. And so in response to this, in response to the biggest challenge of our environmental movement, the big national environmental groups hardly did anything. Even the Sierra Club, when this challenge was presented, we were overwhelmed by it. And so a couple activists, a couple community organizations started to organize against these coal plants. The Endek coal plant, 50 miles south of Illinois, was one of the early targets. A couple activists, some from the Sierra Club, some from some other community groups, began knocking on doors. They'd never targeted a coal plant before, they'd never pulled air permits, they'd never litigated against a utility, but they studied up. They worked late nights, got up early in the morning, worked weekends, organized, built a coalition of community groups, doctors, nurses, low-income rate advocates, scientists, climate scientists, and eventually, after years, they won. They stopped the plant from being built. A regional coalition of organizations began to work together to oppose every single coal plant that was being floated in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. And of several dozen proposed coal plants, almost every single coal plant was defeated, never built. That created a national coalition of hundreds of organizations. The big groups got involved. They were inspired by local grassroots, often unpaid volunteers to target their coal plants. And of those original 200 coal plants that were being proposed, 190 of them were defeated. 190. That is one of the most unknown but most effective stories of grassroots environmental activism that our country has ever seen. And it came totally from the bottom up, completely from the bottom up. And in reality, it didn't cut an ounce of carbon pollution. All that we did for all of that work was to stop things from getting a whole lot worse. So over the last few years, what has happened has been the same movement has targeted the existing coal fleet. There's 523 coal plants in the United States as of January 1st of 2010. You all knew that, right? Our goal as a movement is to shut them all down and to replace them with clean energy by the end of the next decade. And we're already more than a third of the way there. This same coalition of hundreds of local, regional, national environmental groups has worked together to make sure that plant by plant by plant, utility by utility by utility, state by state by state, we put coal in our rearview mirror and we replace that power with clean energy, and we take care of the workers. We make sure that the communities and the workers who are impacted by this transition are brought along and made sure that their recovery is locked into our vision for a clean energy future. So where we stand now is we have an opportunity, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're articulating what actually we want, what we want to see, not just for Cleveland or the state of Ohio or the Great Lakes region, but across the whole country. And increasingly what you're seeing is groups like the Sierra Club and many other groups are rallying around a vision for 100% clean energy for the state of Ohio, in the city of Cleveland, and everywhere across the country. We want to make sure that all fossil fuels, all dirty fuels, are replaced with clean energy over the next couple decades. So the Sierra Club is launching our Ready for 100 campaign. Our goal is within the next 3 years to secure commitments, legally binding commitments, from 100 cities and 100 companies, churches, mosques, synagogues, and universities across the country to go all the way to 100% clean energy. And the reason why we're doing this is in part because the urgency of climate change is so severe. We're already at 9/10 of a degree of warming Celsius, and look at the damage that we've already wrought around the world. We have to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius for entire nations to continue to exist, to prevent hundreds of millions of climate refugees from being created all around the world, to protect our quality of life. But we're not doing this just out of a sense of obligation. We're doing this out of a sense of opportunity. Fighting climate change isn't something that we've got to do. It's also something that we get to do. We want to inject optimism into this debate. Rather than exporting coal and gas or oil to other countries. We should be exporting solutions. We should be exporting a vision of how society can be powered with energy that is 100% safe and secure and sustainable for everybody, for everyone. So I wanted to close by, since I'm here at the City Club, and since this is a forum that is designed to foster honesty and a clear and candid dialogue, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that this is not an easy thing to do, and to express our commitment at the Sierra Club to lean into this challenge and to really face what it means to transition the city or the state or our entire country to clean energy. I feel like I don't have to spend much time talking about the benefits. Certainly don't have to spend that much time talking about the science of climate change, at least not with you all, or what will happen when we transition to clean energy. Regardless of what political party you or your crazy aunt and uncle might belong to, regardless of what your vocation is, whether you like to spend time in the wilderness, what you do there, whether you hunt, fish, backpack, read poetry by a full moon, regardless of who you are, almost every one of us, we care about clean air. We're very fond of clean water. We want to see our family thrive. We want to see our community be strong and resilient. We want to see our country thrive. We want to see a future that is, for our kids, that is better than the one that we're in right now. I think almost all of us can unite around very basic concepts, what might be called environmentalism, what might be called common sense. But the challenge of doing this is going to be hard. Right now, even in Ohio, 67% of the electricity here comes from coal. Still, almost 40% of our electricity across the country comes from coal, a little bit less than that. And even though it's transitioning, we still use gas. Coal and gas make up a majority of power that's produced in every state across the country. There are thousands of families, good families, tens of thousands of workers whose income, often their identity, is tied to oil or coal or natural gas. There are counties throughout the West, states throughout the West, and many parts of the country whose tax base, whose revenue, whose schools are paid for by fossil fuels. So the success of the environmental movement isn't just about how we curb carbon pollution. It's not even about how quickly we scale up clean energy. It's how well this transition works for all of us. Sierra Club wants to do for clean energy what John Muir did for wilderness protection a century ago. But our effort to transition to clean energy isn't just about polar bears or carbon, concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. We want to make sure that for every coal plant that is retired, it is replaced with clean energy and good family-sustaining jobs. We want to make sure that as every gas plant is replaced, we want to make sure that that is replaced with a combination of geothermal and solar and wind, energy storage, energy efficiency, conservation that works for the communities that live around that plant and the state around that area. It is imperative for all environmentalists and those who work in the fossil fuel sector to acknowledge the scale of this challenge, to acknowledge the depth of this challenge, and to have an honest, tough dialogue to determine what it will take to go from an entire economy that is largely based on fossil fuels to an entire economy that is based on clean energy. What we know is that this change is irreversible. Once you shut down a coal plant, once you replace natural gas, once you stop fracking in a watershed, once you begin to create a society where our tuna fish isn't laden with mercury, once we have a country where a third of the people don't live in places where it's unsafe to breathe, which is where we're at right now, once we can guarantee clean water for everybody, we're not going to go back. People won't get nostalgic and say, I really want to be made sick. So think about what we are a part of today. I mean, if you look across the country, it is hard to find optimism about where our country is going. Regardless of what your political persuasion is, regardless of who you want to see elected at any level of office, there are a lot of people who have a lot of fear and concern about a lot of issues, and rarely do we hear an expression of determination and optimism about our ability as a society, as a country, to collectively solve our problems. But we are making this transition to clean energy. How we make that transition is up to us. How quickly we make that transition is up to us. But the transition to clean energy across our economy is inevitable. It is irreversible, and it's something to be excited about. So I want to end with a couple quotes. First one is about the scale of this challenge and why we should embrace the difficulty of it. And if you work for an environmental organization, or if you're a member of an environmental organization, if you're a volunteer of an environmental organization, if you've thought about climate change, you will almost always hear people refer to the moonshot. If the United States could put a man on the moon, then we could blah, 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 blah. That plus the Margaret Mead quote about never doubting a few group of concerned citizens can change the world. Those are the two most quoted things that you'll find in the environmental movement. So following in that transition, in the tradition, I wanted to quote from John F. Kennedy, because this part of his speech where he announced the desire to put a man on the moon, I love, because I think it's one of the most important things, not just for this challenge, but to reflect on why we should do hard things. So here's what Kennedy said in 1963. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Gandhi said that the difference between what we're doing and what we're capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems. So I want to thank the City Club for inviting me here today, because I think together we can help close that gap. Thank you.
He's really tall. I'm Dan Malthrop, CEO of the City Club, and today we're enjoying a forum featuring Michael Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club. It is hard. You could get those confused. We encourage you to organize your questions for Mr. Brune now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via that web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of City Club programs are made possible by PNC and Cleveland State University, along with Robert Conrad and the Payne Fund. Be sure to join us on Friday, February 5th, as we welcome D. Michael Langford, National President of the Utility Workers Union of America, for a conversation on the importance of rebuilding our energy infrastructure for the 21st century. For more information about any of our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is the Hope and Stanley Adelstein Forum on the Environment, made possible by an endowment gift from Hope and Stanley. We thank them for their continued support. Our community partner for today's forum is the Sierra Club Ohio chapter. Thank you very much. We also welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. We thank you all for your support. Additionally, we welcome students to today's program from Horizon Science Academy and St. Martin de Porres High School. Student participation is made possible by the Loeb Fund, or the Loeb Foundation, rather. Will the students please stand to be recognized? Thank you very much. And now it's time to return to Mr. Brune for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and our Marketing and Outreach Fellow, Faye Walker. May we have the first question, please?
Mr. Brune, welcome to Cleveland. I hope you realize you're in a crowd of doers who are optimistic because they do things. One of my plans is to put a small solar installation on a house I have in western North Carolina to produce electric power. Since it's an all-electric house. One of the issues with doing that is that you need an interconnection with a utility, and there's a lot of resistance among the utilities, even among small cooperatives, to small distributed production and how to deal with it. And I'm sure there are ways to deal with it technologically, but it's probably more a political question. So, and there also are issues around producing power and moving them from place to place. So there's a lot of issues around the grid and expanding power lines all over the nation. In Western Carolina, actually, there was one proposed recently that was killed by citizen protest. So now they got to figure out another way to deal with their issue. So what are the things that can be done to deal with these issues on the grid and make it more powerful so distributed power would be more easily accomplished?
All right, thanks for the question. What was your name? Jerry. Okay, so Jerry, thanks for the question. You're highlighting a few different challenges. So one is this reality, which is present in a lot of states, not everywhere across the country, where you have utilities who are more oppositional to clean power or certain kinds of clean power, particularly distributed, decentralized power. Across the country, what we're doing is we're moving from a grid that is dominated by large central stations, coal, gas, nuclear plants, towards one that will be dominated by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands eventually of energy sources. And for the model that has been established by most utilities, the regulated monopoly that they've enjoyed has stifled that kind of innovation. And even though you'll see most utilities support large-scale wind farms or large-scale solar farms, they are at best neutral and often oppositional to the small-scale distributed generation, in part because they feel that it eats into their market share and their business model is threatened by that. I think that what we have to do as a society is to recognize, first, to have a candid conversation again, that is a significant challenge. Moving from one to the other is a challenge. And there's different elements of it that you brought up. The need for better transmission, the need for storage to help to balance the load, the need to find a way to economically, again, as I mentioned before, make sure that workers are part of the solution as well. Regarding your specific issue, this is something that we're fighting all across the country, the Sierra Club and lots of groups, to make sure that homeowners or business owners are paid for the solar, in this case, power that they're providing into the grid at a reasonable rate. And also the utility is fairly compensated for the other services that it provides. What is happening is the utilities are protesting too much in the sense that they are trying to flood the market with these excessive costs so as to stifle the amount of clean energy that's coming online. They have been successful in places like Nevada recently, in Arizona partially, and a few other states. But the transition to more distributed clean energy is inevitable. We're seeing more and more families, hundreds of thousands of families that are installing clean energy because they want energy security. They want to be able to provide their own power, many of them because they're saving money, many of them because they're concerned about climate change, many of them because they think that clean energy is awesome, it's cool, it's exciting. And they want to power not just their homes, but also their vehicles with power from the sun. So this is a big challenge, and I think that we have to acknowledge that the transition is real. The difficulties for utilities are real. I'm sure Mike Langford will talk about it next week. But it shouldn't slow the rate, or it shouldn't prevent us from making this transition. Thanks for the question.
My name is Yoli Rodriguez. I'm from Horizon Science Academy, Cleveland High School. I was very interested in what you said that some communities have their major source of income from fossil fuels. Do you think that removing fossil fuels from those economies could be worse than the pollution we are having right now? Do you think the solution could be worse than the problem? Thank you.
Well, I think that it's not a question about whether we have to shift. Our country is going to change its economy to be powered by clean energy in the course of this century. We're going to do it because fossil fuels are becoming more expensive in most places. We're going to do it because the environmental pollution, aside from climate change, is becoming more and more severe. Most of the easy coal and gas and oil has already been extracted. The remainder is more expensive to get, more dangerous to get, more difficult to get. And because we have to respond to climate change. So this transition will happen. Whether or not we make the transition in a way where we find new revenue sources and identify new revenue sources for states like Wyoming or Utah that are dependent on fossil fuels is up in the air. Whether or not we take care of the workers in the mining industry, coal mining industry, let's say, in Appalachia or throughout southern Illinois and other places, is also up in the air. Right now, we are on a course to not do that. We are not having a very rigorous debate right now in most states or federally about how to make sure communities are brought along in this transition. And so I don't think necessarily that the cure would be worse than the disease in this sense, but I do feel as though, as a society, we're not responding to this part of the challenge. And I think it's the responsibility of everyone. It's the reason why I brought it up is because I do think it's the responsibility for environmental organizations, the Sierra Club and everybody, to make sure that we are honest about the dangers and the risks of a clean energy transition and developing policies that respond to those risks and empathizing on a personal level with the struggle of families who will be caught in that transition. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't embrace that transition, but it does mean that we have to do it in a responsible way.
Hello.
Hi.
You expressed surprise earlier that so many of us are optimistic about the future, and I was one of those people who raised my hand, so I wanted to tell you why.
Great.
I'm working with a national organization that helps introduce renewable energy to large users of energy, big corporations, hospitals, universities in this area. They've done it in other areas outside this area, and they've been able to deliver clean energy, renewable energy, for about 15% less than brown energy to many of their customers, and that's what we're doing here. The answer is, how do you do that? You have to sign a long-term power purchase agreement to motivate people to invest in large solar farms or wind farms. But you don't have to invest any capital because someone else is investing in it. But it provides clean energy at a lower cost. And many of these large companies find that very attractive because of the economics, in addition to improving their image and their future risk for energy.
Thanks for sharing that. That has been our experience as well. So earlier when I was talking about all these coal plants that have come offline, what I didn't talk about too much or spend too much time on is what happens after those coal plants come offline. And what we're seeing is that by taking coal, and in certain cases gas, off the market, it's creating a massive market share for solar and wind, which is helping to accelerate this very virtuous, positive reinforcement cycle, where the more clean energy that is installed, the more prices come down. The more prices come down, the better an economic argument can be made, so the more clean energy is installed, and so on and so forth. So what we are seeing is in Oklahoma, solar and wind are cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, cheaper than nuclear power. In Iowa, in South Dakota, in Texas, in Colorado, in Minnesota, in New Mexico, in California, in the state of Washington, in Massachusetts, in New York. In many parts, a majority of states across the country, solar and wind are cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, cheaper than nuclear power. That is why the president put it in his State of the Union. He couldn't have said that in his State of the Union 3 years ago. He definitely couldn't have said it 5, 6, 7 years ago. That fact is revolutionary. It's why Apple is now going to 100% clean energy. It's why Walgreens and Starbucks and IKEA are all going to 100% clean energy. It's why we picked Cleveland. Because in Cleveland, if Cleveland can go to 100% clean energy, anybody can do this. If we can, in the heart of Ohio, where there are different ways to interpret what I said. But if we can build a model in Cleveland with the manufacturing history and prowess and legacy that we have here, and if we can show how we can transition to clean energy and it's an economic boon, game's over. And we'll do it every place across the country.
Hi, my name is Larry Viterna.
Hi, Larry.
You mentioned the setback Ohio has had in the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. I'd like to hear your insights on how that happened. I mean, it seems some of it may be obvious, but maybe you got better insight. How much there was external influence to doing that, and then how best to counter that at this point?
Well, I think there are people here who have had a more closer relationship to that reversal and maybe some more painful stories to tell. What I would observe is that for me, it seems akin to what's happening in Flint. And it seems to me that what happened in Ohio is an example of ideology trumping reality, trumping common sense, and trumping good public policy. We've always had divided government in our country. We've always had opposing parties. We've often had periods of time where one political party was more interested in defeating the other political party versus promoting smart policies. On climate and energy, there used to be a few issues that were bipartisan. Environmentalism used to be bipartisan. Tiny examples it still is. But particularly on energy, it used to be that we would always agree on energy efficiency. We would almost always agree on curbing oil consumption because of the foreign policy implications as well as climate implications. And we would almost always agree on solar. And across the country, that is still the case. I challenge anybody here to point to a public poll that doesn't show a majority of support for clean energy or energy efficiency. There isn't one. In almost every public poll I've seen, the numbers are north of 70% support across parties for clean energy, for energy efficiency, for reducing our dependence on oil. But I think what has happened in Ohio, and the reason why I draw the connection to Flint is because you have a certain political worldview that crowds out everything else. And it's reigns supreme. And you have elected officials at all levels of government who are putting their own pre-packaged ideological perspective ahead of the public interests and ahead of the things upon which we almost always agree anyway, and upon which there's broad bipartisan support. The rollbacks on energy efficiency, I think, are particularly lamentable just because the examples that you've created in Ohio, where the state has formally saved billions of dollars, and you still have utilities that are still making investments in energy efficiency, billions of dollars have been saved, air pollution has been minimized, water pollution has been minimized, jobs have been created for a solution that was then taken away. And I think it's a regrettable symptom of the political environment that we're in right now.
Hi, Michael. Jeremy Kusid. I work with the Meat Free Mondays coalition that is incubated here in Northeast Ohio with the Sierra Club Neo, the NEO site that has extensive information about the effects of agricultural practices, and a quote from Jane Goodall gave us her quote for how to reduce manure into our Great Lakes, referring to the now with the I wanted to ask just really quickly with the to compensate for the methane disaster. Time Magazine said it was adding 4 million cars to the road. And there were some things that were like, it was like 2 million cars have been added to the road. And you saw some like conspiracy type videos that were like, it's 7 million cars that need. So, but there's if we could make like, healthy, fiber promotions, eat the rainbow promotions, like we're looking for that earmark. With the state has a lot of buffer zone land use management practices going for manure, soil retention, and that's so valuable. But we want to appeal to our Senator Brune is on the Agriculture Committee, our Representative Marcia Fudge is on the Agriculture Committee, and also Senator Portman has a lot of agricultural history. And so where do you think is time most well spent if it's promoting like healthy meals, like with that those Sierra Club members would most get behind? Because we're looking at like schools and hospitals and those big food service providers, and the other one's jails. So appreciate your feedback.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks for your comments and your question and all your good work. So the title of the speech here today was about clean energy and climate change and those solutions. And I think it's a reflection of most talks on climate change given by most people, that most of the focus is on energy, which is, I think, justified and also incomplete. Because if you look around the world, 20% in a given year, changes every year, but according to the UN, at least 20% of all pollution, carbon pollution, climate change pollution, let's say, comes from land use changes. There are some figures that put that higher, 30, 40%, but by and large, a conservative, incredible analysis that it's 20%. And that includes deforestation, but it also includes food, agriculture. And it's a missing gap, I think, in what the climate movement is doing. We have a very large, vibrant, diverse, and exciting food movement. We have a very large, diverse, and exciting climate movement. And there's you, and maybe a few other folks, being a little bit facetious, who are trying to unite the two. So I agree that this is an important issue. I often get asked what can an individual do to have an impact on climate. I think eating less meat is an important step that people can take. I think that voting with your dollars are also important things. But clearly, the role of agriculture and meat production in climate change is an important one to address. So the Sierra Club, I don't have a specific answer on where to spend your time. What I can say is that the Sierra Club this year is, we're doing a study to figure out how we can play a more constructive and powerful role on climate change regarding agriculture production, and what role food production and consumption has, and what ways can we empower and support our members, 2.4 million members, groups and chapters, to engage on this effectively. So I appreciate your question.
Yeah, Michael. Just wondered if you could talk a second about the impact of the KXL pipeline organizing on the climate movement and just generally the environmental movement as a whole. Because by the way I look at things, after the defeat of the climate legislation in 2010 in the summer, the climate movement was almost dead in the water. And then with the organizing of the KXL pipeline movement, it really took off, and that is where people started saying that there was actually a real movement going on. So I just wanted to know what your opinion of what the impact of the KXL, anti-KXL pipeline was.
Sure.
Movement and organizing.
Sure, thanks for the question. So I think the Keystone XL, for those of you who weren't following this, I know many were, Keystone XL is a pipeline that was proposed that would have taken oil all the way from Canada, some of the dirtiest, most carbon-intensive oil on the planet, toxic, flammable oil, through a pipeline all the way from Alberta and Canada all the way through the country, most of which would have been exported. We were opposed to it. Lots of groups were opposed to it. Indigenous communities and communities along the route were opposed to it because of the risks to people's water supply, their farms, their ranches, and then the toxic chemicals that would come out when the oil was to be refined. The fight itself was important for two reasons, and I wanted to talk about it because what happens after it is also important. It was important, obviously, substantively, because this was, for us, groups who were working to fight it, the first big national fight to keep dirty fuels in the ground. We know that if we're going to be effective and successful on climate change, about 80% of all the coal, all the gas, all the oil that we know about, all the way around the world, everywhere, has to remain in the ground, unextracted. That's just physics. That's basic science. We also know that last year, sovereign governments, oil companies that are owned by sovereign governments and private oil companies like Exxon, Shell, Chevron, spent $650 billion to identify new sources of coal and oil and gas. So let that sit with you for a minute. We have to keep 80% of all the reserves that we know about in the ground, and we're spending more than $500 billion finding new sources. So Keystone was a great example of a way in which we could fight this issue. It was also important symbolically. And I found your comment was very interesting because the belief that the environmental movement was dead in the water in 2010 is a climate movement. It is often said, but it doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. So yes, the climate movement failed miserably, spectacularly in trying to get a climate bill through Congress and trying to get a climate treaty established in Copenhagen. And the optics of the climate movement were that we didn't have much power, we weren't that effective, which belied the reality on the local level, because during that time, community groups were really effective at stopping new coal plants from being built, were effective at shutting down existing coal plants, were really good at beginning to resist fracking across the country, were highly effective at the renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency. But what we needed was something around which we could all work together, a specific project, a specific fight. And we needed a narrative that would help to show how our movement is growing, that was strong, that we were inclusive and diverse, and Keystone helped to provide that. So now that we've won, and when we won, when the president rejected the pipeline and made his announcement, not only did he reject the pipeline, but he said, we have to keep dirty fuels in the ground. And in his comments, he reflected on the power of the movement that helped to produce this victory. So I think that where we go from now is we have to take an isolated incident, an isolated victory where we won against a particular pipeline, and make it the new normal, where we should not be investing in any new infrastructure if it makes the problem worse. The basic, the rule of holes is if you find yourself in one and you want to get out, stop digging, right? If you're in a house that is burning and you would like the flames to be put out, don't pour gasoline on the fire. If you have a problem, first don't make it worse. So that is what Keystone helped inspire us to do, is to first stop the problem by stop making it worse. Stop making big multi-billion-dollar investments in new dirty fuels infrastructure and redirect those investments instead in clean energy. So we want to, with the next administration, we want to make sure that that is the new normal. And our expectations is that we won't continue to expand the fossil fuel industry. We want to shrink it and transition.
Hi, Jessica Ferrato with Sierra Club.
Hi, Jessica.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the economics of the transition, especially considering you have a background in economics. It's a good time to draw you in. It's clear that the economics it's a positive transition in terms of jobs. We're bringing good jobs, green jobs conference here to Cleveland in June. Energy savings and so on. I wanted to ask you what the transition has to do with the price of oil. Specifically for those of us who drive gas-powered cars, we're seeing the prices drop. Can that be seen as a reflection to what degree can that be seen as a reflection of the triumph of green energy? Or is it more, market manipulation and politics that, what aspects can you comment on that?
Well, I don't think the low price of oil can be seen as a triumph of green energy. If someone wants to spin it that way, I would be very interested in that perspective. I think that what green energy can take credit for is the low price of solar, the low price of wind, the fact that companies and cities and utilities many utilities are transitioning towards clean energy, the jobs, the economic benefits of all of that. I think the current low price of oil is due to a bunch of other factors, glut in the market domestically and internationally. You are seeing a flattening of demand for clean energy, or for oil in the U.S. It's not just flattening, but it's come down from about 22 million barrels of oil per day to around 18 or so today. So that is putting a ceiling on future consumption. But I think a driving factor also is the amount of supply that's coming online as well. So I think that the low price of clean energy, the low price of oil has two different impacts. One is that it's going to keep a lot of extreme energy in the ground. The tar sands is no longer economically viable. Drilling in the Arctic doesn't make economic sense. Drilling in deeper water doesn't make sense. Fracking on public lands is making less and less sense solely from an economic perspective. And so from a supply side perspective, the wind is at our backs. Those of us who want to keep dirty fuels in the ground and accelerate a transition to clean energy. The challenge is whether or not electric vehicles have enough of a foothold in the market in order to be firmly established. And so the big fight over the next couple years is going to be the same fight that we fought about 7 or 8 years ago, where right now every automaker around the country is compelled to raise their fuel economy from about 22, 23 miles per gallon, which is where they used to be, to 54.5 miles per gallon. And many automakers want to take advantage of a loophole in that provision, which will open up in 2017 and 2018 to stall the rate of investment in electric vehicles. You have a bunch of companies, obviously, like Tesla, Nissan, other companies. Apple now is moving into electric vehicles. Google is moving into electric vehicles. A lot of forward-thinking, innovative companies are investing in clean energy. Many other larger automakers are digging in their heels, and it's not clear whether they'll make that full transition. So thank you.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Michael Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club. Thank you, Mr. Brune. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.